We are in the midst of a cultural revolution right now. Our history, and yes, I'm talking about American history, but it's not just the United States of America, it's South America, it's the United Kingdom, and the rest of the Western world, is currently being rewritten by far left activists at this very moment. And contrary to what these activists will tell you, and what media pundits will tell you about this rewrite, it is being rewritten to be even less accurate than it was previously, not more accurate. It's more narrow interpretations, and it's all designed to create an era of guilt around the Western world in order to make way for a new, presumably socialistic regime to eventually take over. Now, one of the biggest battlegrounds of this cultural revolution has to do with historic statues that are all around the United States, the United Kingdom, and other parts of Europe that people on the far left have now deemed to be culturally insensitive, basically because they're doing the equivalent of digging up old tweets on these historic figures. You can see this in obvious cases like Winston Churchill, where people are trying to rewrite his history in order to make him out to be some significant racist or somehow not the guy who stood up to the Nazi regime. One of the biggest lies and misnomers specifically related to Winston Churchill has to do with the Bengali famine, which they now for some reason are arguing is the fault of Winston Churchill, which only works if you ignore the fact that this famine went on during World War II, and Bengal was the exact same place that the Japanese happened to be attacking, and while they were attacking it, just coincidentally and not related to the famine, this was also the place where they burned all the food that was coming into this nation. And people quote mine, they cite Winston Churchill refusing wheat from Canada, but they don't really go into the full story because, again, it's about manufacturing a false history in order to push for a power grab rather than being more accurate. So while it is true that they refused wheat from Canada to relieve the Bengali famine, the reason they did that was not because they hated the people of this nation. It was because wheat shipped from Canada would take 2 months. 2 months into a war zone where that wheat could have eventually been shipped. This is why Winston Churchill, and by the way, you can check the sources of this in the description of this video and read the man's own letters to the key government officials involved while this was going on for yourself. It's in English because that's what they spoke in England, that's what they still speak in England, decided that Australia, which is significantly closer to Bengal, should be the one to ship in the wheat. However, because the Japanese continuously sunk ships and created problems in the supply line, despite his best efforts to relieve that famine, the consequences of World War II could not be mitigated for those people. And the fact that the people pushing this anti-Churchill narrative are probably not even aware of or are actively lying by omission by not telling you that this was all going on during World War II, and it would have made absolutely no sense for Churchill to give up a British territory to a famine during a war, because India at the time was in fact a British territory, tells you all you need to know about these people's commitment to historical accuracy. They're propagandists, and yet Churchill statue right now, as I'm recording this video, is in a box. Now, before I delve in further on this issue of defacing our monuments, destroying our statues, I want to give you my position, my two positions on statues within the United States, and you can apply it to the world over, but I'm going to focus on the United States of America because I'm a citizen of the United States of America. And the reason I have two positions is because there are two different contexts that we need to go over. The first is the context right now, and my position on the context right now is we should give in not 1 inch to the mob that is ripping down our statues and trying to rewrite our history. These people are ignorant radicals, and they are not playing by the rules of our society, and in no way, shape, or form should we give in a single inch to them and reward this type of behavior. What's essentially going on right now is that we're basically in a situation where there's a treaty that says that the war is going to end in 5 days. And wherever you are when the war ends in the next 5 days, that's what you get to keep. So the left is basically blitzing, trying to cover as much ground as humanly possible before order is restored in order to secure their position in order to advance on us later. This is why right now, in this very moment, we should push back on every single point that the left is putting forward as long as there continues to be violence in the streets. That being said, there is a more nuanced position when it comes to these statues, and that has to do with the categories that a lot of these statues tend to fall under. And that's what I want to give you. But I want to make sure you guys know right now that this is for after things calm down, when people decide that they're going to play by the rules, when the people who are defacing our public monuments are held to account for the crimes that they're committing. Now, to understand my position on statues and monuments when there isn't rioting, when law and order is actually restored, and everybody is playing by the same set of rules, you need to understand the three separate categories that I put a lot of these statues and monuments into. And those categories are as follows. There's American history pre and post Civil War. There's pre-American history. This would be your Columbus or people, who settled certain parts of this nation before it was actually the United States of America. And then there are Civil War monuments, and specifically Civil War monuments in states that never joined the Confederacy, despite the fact that these monuments are two figures in the Confederacy. Now, even though I was born in Texas, I moved to New York when I was 7 years old, and my parents were originally from the Northeast, so I'm a Northerner. So I have no attachment to the Confederate battle flag. I have no nostalgia based on stories that I heard about the Civil War, which I think in the South is called something weird like the War of Northern Aggression or whatever. I got no love for that. So the Confederacy is not high on my list of priorities to preserve. That being said, there is an element of historical preservation for Confederate states that actually fought in the war. So for the most part, Confederate monuments that were built at and around the time of the Civil War, totally fine with in those states. However, a lot of Confederate monuments that were put up around the United States, exist in states that never joined the Confederacy. In fact, they were actively fighting against the Confederacy, and they were put up in the 50s and 60s. And you can understand why Confederate statues, based on the history of the United States of America, were put up in this country in the 50s and 60s. And they're also relatively cheap statues. They're not made particularly well because they were trying to rust these statues up during the civil rights movement. Now, in normal times, when rule of law reigns supreme in the United States of America, if you are a person in one of these northern cities or places that have Confederate monuments, and you don't feel like those monuments erected in the 50s and 60s represent a history that you want to share, I think it is perfectly reasonable for you to go to your representatives and have them taken down. And that doesn't necessarily mean the statues have to be destroyed, because they are a part of our American history. They could be moved to Confederate cemeteries, somewhere where, the people that actually died in that battle on that side of the war can actually have a statue honoring them. Because if you still consider them Americans, even though they did rebel against the United States of America, and you want them to be honored, it would make sense in context for Confederate statues to be there. You can also move them to museums so people can see them on display. And you don't have to replace them with some goofy, left-wing activist or whatever. You can leave them blank. But if people in the community have a better suggestion for who to replace the statue with, I'm totally fine with that, as long as they go through the process and don't try to rip these statues down, because as we've seen time and time again, people can get seriously hurt. And it's also crazy illegal to do this to public property, so I don't want anybody to get hurt, and I do think that in a normal time, when rule of law is being respected, if you don't want something in your community that your taxpayer dollars are paying to upkeep, then it makes sense to go through the process and get that removed. Now, with that being said, the Founding Fathers and American historical figures that predate and postdate the Civil War, they get to stay without exemption, especially the Founding Fathers. You don't get to rip down portions of our history because you're mad that these people lived in a different context and a different time period. The fact that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves is an ancillary fact to Thomas Jefferson's life and is not the thing that we honor him for. The same thing is true with George Washington and many other historical figures. But even people who didn't own slaves are subject to being ripped down because their statues are somehow promoting white supremacy. Case in point, Abraham Lincoln, the man who signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the man who was president during the Civil War, and not the president of the Confederacy, for those of you who are confused out there. And yes, that's the same Civil War that ended with the abolishment of slavery, unless you're an idiot conspiracy theorist who buys the propaganda in the movie 13th that thinks that actually the Civil War ended with the legalization of slavery, or whatever absurd thing Ava DuVernay put forward in that ridiculous film. Lincoln's statues stay, and I don't care if you did the equivalent of digging up old tweets on Abraham Lincoln, looking at things that he said while he was campaigning to win the office of the presidency. The man literally took a gunshot in the back of the head for a war that ended slavery in the United States of America. And by the way, the offending statue of Abraham Lincoln that has drawn so much ire, the one that's so problematic by 2020 standards, it needs to be taken down, is a statue that was literally originally paid for by the donations of freed slaves to honor Abraham Lincoln. And the chain that is broken in the hands of the slave depicted is symbolic of the struggle of slaves before Lincoln to free themselves. Frederick Douglass actually spoke at the opening of this statue when it was completed. But now that very statue that was paid for by people who actually experienced the horrors that the woke of today are so concerned about in the past needs to be erased in the name of telling the real truth about American history. Absolute nonsense. It stays 100%, and you ought to be ashamed of yourself for thinking that your faux outrage, which is based entirely on your complete and utter ignorance of history, should supersede the achievements of people who actually experienced those horrors. Now, next on the list is Columbus and other pre-American historical figures, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to you. I think that they should stay. You shouldn't tear down Columbus statues, especially not Columbus statues. Columbus did not think the world was flat. Columbus did not get lost. Columbus did not commit a genocide against the natives. The population numbers of the Tainos that people give usually come from like 1542. Columbus died in 1506. He wasn't the governor of the territories after 1500. His sons were dead. The truth is, and this should only be surprising to people who are under the age of 5, the people in 1492 were more brutal than the people that existed today. But Columbus was not unique in his level of brutality. In fact, one of the things that made Columbus unique from the other people who came over on the voyage is that Columbus was actually incarcerated by the Spanish monarchy for how badly he punished the Spaniards. I said this before on this channel and I'll say it again. Most, and by most I mean 90 to 95% of the native populations in North America, South America, and the Caribbean died due to communicable diseases that they did not have an immunity for. And what that means is that no matter who came over, no matter how friendly they were, 95% of that population had no immunity to the diseases that people in Europe, Africa, and Asia were already immune to. So they're going to die just based on that alone. That's unfortunate, but that's what the history tells us. They just didn't have the immunity to that. That's something that we should all be able to understand, especially after months of lockdown during a pandemic. Attributing all those deaths to one person is completely absurd. At some point throughout human history, somebody was going to find North and South America, and the same exact level of deaths due to viruses were going to happen. But denying the significance of being the person who pushed for this voyage, who landed on this strange land, and without even knowing the significance of this, being the person who united two segments of the human population that were separated 10,000 plus years prior to the voyage, is an achievement that is unparalleled and will likely never be paralleled until we discover some foreign alien colony of humans somewhere on the other side of Mars. There's a reason this country is named after him. There's a reason our capital is named after him. There's a reason that multiple cities in the United States of America, Latin America, Canada, and Europe are named after this person. It's because of the significance of this achievement. And if you want to give the Vikings credit, that's fine, but you can't pretend that the impact of the Vikings having a little settlement in North America was anywhere near as significant as Columbus's voyage was. So yes, Christopher Columbus's statues, they stay. Columbus Day as a holiday stays. If you want to have Indigenous Peoples Day or something for the Native Americans, then pick a different day and make that the holiday. The idea that we should change Christopher Columbus Day into Indigenous Peoples Day just so on Indigenous Peoples Day we can spend all of our time trash talking Christopher Columbus and trying to get the rest of the country to stop recognizing his day is absolutely ridiculous. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue to get us a day off askew, and we should honor that. Anyway, those are my thoughts on statues and monuments at this moment in the culture war. If you guys disagree with me, then please feel free to let me know your wrong opinions down in the comments below, because my thoughts are 100% accurate. My opinions are literal facts, and if you disagree with me, you're just wrong. But as always, you guys know the drill. Like, share, subscribe, the whole thing. Thank you guys so much for your support that's been coming through lately on Patreon, Venmo, Subscribestar, and PayPal. Really appreciate it. Till next time.